The first time I saw this creature was in my childhood. I was 12 years old. My great-grandmother had died, and it was the first time I'd ever been to a funeral. It was winter. Snow was falling heavily. My relatives were crying, and I wasn't upset like them. Rather, I was confused. I hadn't yet understood what it meant to say goodbye to someone forever. The coffin was on a high sled. I wondered what it would be like to ride one of those down a hill. I stroked the cemetery mongrels, trying to occupy myself with something interesting, while the adults were doing what they thought was important. The cemetery staff also stood by and waited in silence for everyone to say goodbye so they could nail the lid shut and lower the coffin into the grave. Being bored, I started looking around and noticed this. I didn't even know how to describe him because I had never seen anything like that before. A walking scarecrow that didn't look alive. It was a tall, pale yellow creature with a long head that looked like an insect cocoon. There were holes instead of eyes, mouth, and nose. Its limbs looked like long sticks. This ridiculous creature wandered among the fences, staggering around in the snowfall for no reason. I wondered, why don't adults notice him? Usually, people stare when they see something strange. I looked at the walking scarecrow with curiosity, about to ask the adults what it was, but one of the cemetery workers distracted me by touching my shoulder.
"Don't look at him,"
he whispered.
"Look elsewhere, as if you couldn't see anything special."
"Why not?" I asked in the same whisper.
"I'll tell you later,"
the gravedigger promised. I turned away, trying to follow the rules. I thought that all people could see this creature, but pretend it doesn't exist because it is the rule. However, I was wrong. When the scarecrow disappeared over the hillside, the cemetery worker called me over and explained everything in a low voice so that the others couldn't hear.
"You saw him, didn't you? Very few people are able to see him. You can, and so can I. This is the collector. He lives here in the cemetery. He walks around looking for people who spot him. That's why you can't let him know you can do that. The collector is looking for people like us. If he finds out you're seeing him, you're done. If you pretend not to notice, then there's no reason to be afraid of him. When you go to the cemetery, always pretend there's no collector. If you meet him on the same path, don't step aside first. Walk straight ahead. He'll bounce off to the side himself. And one more thing. Never tell anyone about him. Someone who knows about the collector might also see him, and that's a risk. Let it be our secret. Deal, buddy?"
"Deal." I shook the big, cold palm of the gravedigger's hand with an imposing look. My father then asked me what we were talking about, and I said,
"Secret."
It was frightening to learn about the dangerous creature, but I was glad to have a personal secret. As a child, I used to have nightmares about the collector. Sometimes, I had nightmares about my great-grandmother's funeral. I dreamed that I accidentally looked at the skinny creature, and he, noticing it, ran toward me on his thin legs, skipping over the graveside fences. Waking up shuddered. I couldn't tell my parents what I dreamed. It was my secret. Sometimes I would stay awake thinking about the collector for a long time. I imagined him wandering through the cemetery at night. He's there now, isn't he? Does he ever sleep? What is he doing? Inspecting graves? Looking at portraits? As the years passed, I forgot about the cemetery dweller. He became a distant childhood memory that was impossible to take seriously. The second time I saw the collector was in high school. I had a friend, Alex. We went to different schools, but he was closer to me than any of my classmates. Alex and I saw each other almost every evening. We considered each other best friends. It was the warm days of May, not long before summer vacation. I remember it was a Sunday. Alex called me in the morning and asked if I wanted to keep him company. He asked me to go with him to the cemetery to clean his grandfather's grave. I didn't think that would be a good idea, so I suggested going for a walk when he was done.
I can't,
my friend said.
I'm grounded for skipping school. My mother won't let me out of the house. I was happy to even clean my grandfather's grave, as long as I didn't have to sit in my room. Come with me, huh?
Okay, let's go.
I agreed because of the desire to see my friend. On the way, I was reminded of my great-grandmother's funeral. Since then, I had never been to the cemetery. I avoided going there, though it had been a long time since I believed what I had seen as a child. I had also forgotten about my rule of not telling anyone about the collector. So, I told Alex about seeing a strange creature that looked like a living scarecrow at the cemetery when I was a kid. Not only did I see him, but also a cemetery worker who told me that this creature was called a collector. My friend predictably joked that the cemetery worker was drunk and also treated me. We were cleaning up Alex's grandfather's grave, picking up last year's leaves, and pulling weeds. Together we got through the cleaning quickly, and there was still time to go for a short walk. We were about to leave the cemetery when Alex suddenly poked me in the shoulder, pointed his finger somewhere in the distance, and asked,
Is that the one you were talking about?
I automatically looked where he was pointing and saw him. A tall, frail figure stood between the two fences, looking at us with his empty eyes. I turned away sharply and said to my friend,
Don't look at him. Don't do that.
I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting this walking scarecrow to run at us, like in my childhood nightmares. But nothing happened. I opened my eyes and looked at Alex. He kept looking in that direction.
Stop it. Don't let him know that you can see him,
I whispered.
Come on. He seems to be harmless. He's just standing there doing nothing,
answered my friend. He went all pale with surprise, but he seemed delighted. I still didn't dare look in the direction of the collector again.
Don't be afraid. He's already gone.
Alex tried to reassure me, but I was trembling with fear. As we walked back, all my friend could talk about was the collector.
I wonder what he is anyway. Where did he come from? I never believed in anything like that. That's crazy.
I begged him not to tell anyone about what we saw.
Why not? He didn't do anything to us.
Alex wondered, not knowing the reason. I just knew intuitively that we shouldn't talk about him. I had a bad feeling, and it didn't let me down. That was the last time I saw my friend. That night, he disappeared. I found it out the next day. His mother came to me asking questions. She looked into her son's room in the morning to wake him up for school, and there was an empty bed and blanket on the floor. He had gone somewhere in the middle of the night. I was questioned about whether he had said anything to me the day before. Where could he have gone? I had to lie, saying that we had been to the cemetery, cleaned his grandfather's grave, and then went home. I didn't see or hear anything. Nobody could get to know about the collector. And why did I tell Alex about him? Who was pulling my tongue? I promised myself that not a single living soul would ever know about him again. People had been looking for my friend. I really hoped he'd come back safe and sound. No, he didn't. He disappeared without a trace, and that will always be on my conscience. I also promised never to go to the cemetery again, but no one lives forever. It's been more than 10 years since I lost a friend, and now I've lost my father too. He passed away in the hospital from a heart attack. I couldn't miss his funeral. A sense of deep grief freed me from fear. I thought that if I ever met this wretched creature, I would just ignore it. Now I have experience in it. Thankfully, the collector didn't show up at the funeral, and all I could think about was my father. It was so difficult to stay without him. I didn't think it would happen one day. There was the very same, now rather aged cemetery man at the funeral, the one I had met when I was a child, and he seemed to recognize me right away, because when we met, I was the only one he said,
My condolences, buddy.
I have no idea how he recognized me as that 12-year-old boy, but I didn't want to ask, talk about anything, or remember our last encounter. My mother came up to me and, looking at the workers, told me quietly that I should stay at the cemetery. The fence was about to be brought in, and I had to supervise its installation.
No one cares. They'll put it some way and leave. Watch them, please, and we'll be waiting for you at home.
Mom asked. She was suspicious and never trusted anyone, thinking that she had to control everything. But I agreed, just because I wanted to stay alone at my father's grave for a while longer. When else would I get that chance? I don't know how much time passed, maybe an hour, or even more. It was getting dark, and I was starting to get chilly. At dusk, the crosses and monuments turned into black shadows. Here and there, I began to see something tall and skinny. It was scary. I didn't want to glance at that creature. How long am I supposed to wait? Perhaps they decided to put up the fence tomorrow, and I am stuck here for nothing. After one last look at my father's portrait, I headed for the exit. I walked in a hurry. Fear drove me. God forbid I should meet that Scarecrow. Luckily, I didn't meet him, and when I stepped out of the gate, my heart calmed down. Walking down past the garages to the road that led to town, I saw a child. It was a little girl, a first grader with a backpack half her height. The little figure in the gray coat was walking up the cemetery hill. It was dark. The girl was alone, without her parents, walking somewhere and not afraid of anything. As I passed by, I looked into her face. The girl was looking through me with half-closed eyes, walking as if under hypnosis. I tried to reassure myself. You never know where a child might go. Maybe one of her parents is working at the cemetery, or one of their relatives nearby is tinkering in the garage. What am I worrying about? Why should I even care? But then, I couldn't get over my curiosity and looked around. The girl was walking toward the gate of the cemetery, and just outside the fence stood the collector, his thin, pale yellow outline. His long arms and his cocooned head stood out clearly in the darkness. He was waiting for the child at the gate. I wanted to catch up with the girl, to stop her, but I didn't dare. I didn't even have the heart to yell at her.
Stop! Don't go there!
Right, I chickened out, fearful to intervene. Possibly that's why I didn't want to hear anything about the missing child on the city news. But the ads were all over the place. Missing child. There were pictures of the same first grade girl I'd seen the night before, and I couldn't tell anyone about it. It was driving me crazy. What shall I say? I saw a girl walking to the cemetery, where a creature called the Collector was waiting for her. They would have taken me for a madman and suspected me of kidnapping, but I'm tired of being silent. The old cemetery worker was the only person I could talk to. That same day, I raced to the gatehouse in front of the cemetery and asked the man to spare me some time. I was trying to find out where might be the missing people.
Over there.
The cemetery man replied, pointing to the graves.
The ones he took are gone. None of them come back.
I told him I saw a girl yesterday, showed him the post on my phone. The old cemetery worker sighed heavily and replied that he had also seen the child.
Did you see her?
I shrieked with indignation.
Why didn't you do anything?
The elderly worker yelled back at me.
And you?
I dropped my head. He was right.
Nothing could be done about it.
He shouted.
Just don't tell anyone about him. Don't make any extra sacrifices.
Remorse swept over me, and for the first time in years, I confessed what I had kept to myself for so long.
I had already done it. The collector had taken my friend. I told the childish story to my friend, and that creature took him.
The gravedigger hissed at me.
Be quiet.
Though I was tired of being quiet, people went missing, and we just did nothing. In desperation, I ran into the cemetery gate and started yelling at the top of my lungs.
Hey, you! Come out! Where did you take them? Where is my friend? Where's Alex?
My screams echoed and disappeared. In that second, I wasn't afraid. I was ready to face the Scarecrow. Still, no one responded. The collector didn't answer my call. The old gravedigger put his hand on my shoulder and asked me to leave. So I did. It happened to me at night. I woke up, or maybe I didn't. I opened my eyes, saw the dark ceiling, threw off the blanket, got up, found my pants on the floor. All my actions were automatic. It was night, and I was going somewhere. I pulled on a t-shirt and a sweater. There wasn't a single thought in my head. I just did what I did, mindless, as if following an order. I put on my socks, went out into the hallway, slipped my feet into my shoes, and buttoned up my jacket. It seemed to me that this was the intended way. I walked out of the apartment, locked the door, as if I were going to return. I had no idea what I was doing or why. It seemed that I was a passenger in my own body, just an indifferent observer. My feet went down the steps. My finger pressed the intercom door button. I stepped outside. A strong wind was blowing into my face. I had forgotten to put on my hat, but it didn't matter. There was a purpose for walking, so I walked. What's going on? I had no answer to that question. My body dragged itself in a half-sleep through the desolate streets. The route was familiar. I was walking to the cemetery. Why? Was a question I had no answer to either, but it didn't matter at the time. I walked up the hill past the garages. There he stood behind the cemetery gate. The collector was standing on his long legs, with his thin arms hanging down along his body. He looked at me with round black eyes, and I stared at him without feeling any fear. I was just walking toward him, feeling absolutely nothing. As soon as I approached the gate, the creature turned and, tromping like an insect, sped off into the depths of the cemetery. I followed him obediently, wiggling and clinging to the fences with my clothes. I felt nothing. It was as if I'd been drugged. Making no effort to walk, my feet moved on their own. The collector walked for a long time, skirting the fences, leading me like in a labyrinth. Finally, he led me to the very edge of the old part of the cemetery, which was full of abandoned graves. The creature led me to a large black hole in the ground and wiggled to the side. Giving way, I approached the hole. It looked like a huge, deep grave. It was as if the ground had opened up to receive me. I was very sleepy, so I wanted to collapse into that hole and sleep. I went to the very edge, lowered my head, and saw bodies. A whole pile of bodies. Corpses of varying degrees of decomposition covered the bottom, sticking out of the edges of the rift. A huge mountain of the dead. There were dried bones, rotten bloated carcasses, and fresh bodies. A girl, a little girl, and there was her big backpack. How do I know her? It was time to do it. Just fall in the hole and go to sleep. I wanted to lie down, close my eyes. There was a long decayed arm sticking out among the old bones. The color was so toxic that it stood out in the dark. A friend of mine had one just like it. What was his name? Alex. Right, Alex. He disappeared 10 years ago, so that's where he is, lying in the ground, where I should have fallen too. When I remembered this, my senses were awakened. I suddenly realized that I was standing on the edge of the old cemetery at night, and I was about to jump into the pit of decaying corpses to become a part of the collection. That thought cheered me up, and I came to my senses. My heart was beating frantically. I turned and ran. The collector was still standing next to the pit. He wasn't following me, but I was running away from the night cemetery. I fell, tearing my arms, breaking my elbows, but I got up and ran again. The city streets were asleep. No one saw me. I don't know what happens to that huge hole in the old part of the cemetery. Maybe it opens up and then disappears. Or perhaps it's always open, but not everyone can see it, just like the collector. I don't know. Never have I gone there again. I know where the bodies of the missing people are, but would people believe me if I told them? Nevertheless, I don't want to remain silent any longer. The old cemetery worker said I shouldn't tell anyone about the collector, because it might give someone the ability to see him, and that would be a risk. I don't think so anymore. Ignorance is a risk. I'm sure that most of the collector's victims are people who had the rare ability to see him, but didn't know the rules. A person meets this thing in a cemetery, then tells his acquaintances about the incident, and then disappears. Now, someone close to him will be able to see him wandering around the cemetery. That's how it works. Maybe I'm not done with the collector forever. Maybe he'll call me again in the middle of the night, and I'll come to that hole, unable to bring myself to stop. That could happen very soon, so I think it's important to tell people the truth. If you come to the cemetery and happen to meet a tall, pale yellow creature with thin arms and legs and holes instead of eyes, just pretend not to notice him. Don't look in its direction. If you bump into him on the same path, don't turn off. Try not to give yourself away, and don't call him on purpose. Be smarter than I am.